All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's our, like John said, our 17th. Has anyone been to all 17? Have we got a couple who've been here since the beginning. I can't believe that. The first room we did this in was at the Port Authority. I think it was a room maybe 1/10 this size, perhaps. So I'm glad everybody's here. There's been a lot going on in the world, obviously. So every year I come in and try and explain what's been going on over the past year and what's going to be happening over the last couple of years. And hopefully you take something from that for your business, for your personal life, that you can use to create your business strategies, your personal strategies, whatever it may be. Try to make a little sense of it over the next hour or so. So what's going on? Well, we've heard about ISA. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to start by talking about where the economy is now. Of course, we just had some big U.S. economic news yesterday that came out. We'll talk about that. The slide's not up to date, so I'll talk over the slide. We'll talk about what's going to happen in 2024 and in the couple of years thereafter. We have a few big events happening this year, as you may know. And then we'll look at the long-term outlook for the economy and for risk. And we're also going to talk about throughout the presentation what this means for you, how your business can prepare for the changes that are coming, how you can prepare for the changes that are inevitably to come. So where are we with the economy today? It's obviously been a tumultuous few years. Having done this 17 years, I remember coming here sometimes and having some really great positive news to say. I can remember coming here other times and everyone's faces were very sullen. And I can't lie to you, so I didn't have the best news. This year's kind of a mixed bag, right? I mean, we're coming off of what was a much better year than anybody expected here in the US, but of course, 2024 is going to be, in many ways, a challenging year. We've been bouncing from crisis to crisis. The economy has gone from the COVID-19, well, from the financial crisis to crises overseas to the COVID-19 pandemic to inflation. And yet, nevertheless, the economy, particularly here in the United States, more so than in other parts of the world, has been quite resilient. The US economy, and you'll see that in a little bit, has actually outperformed most of its peers in recent years, and in many cases by a pretty wide margin. We're still feeling the impact of the economic impact, that is, of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of the factors that are in place today stem from what happened 4 years ago. Consumer spending, as you probably know, has been the savior of many economies, including the US economy. Consumers continue to spend despite all of the bad news sometimes they hear or some of the uncertainty they may feel. Consumers have continued to spend. And then finally, 17 years ago, when I was speaking here for the first time, we were talking a lot about globalization. We were right in the period of peak globalization. Well, that period's coming to an end. We're seeing a change in global trade, in international investment, and we'll talk about that a little bit, what that means for this region as well. So again, you guys know me. There's lots of numbers in my presentation. Sorry about that, but you all have a copy of the presentation, so you can study those when you have time. This chart shows how fast the global economy has been growing in recent years. This is global economic growth. And before COVID, the economy was incredibly steady globally. It was growing about 3.5% per year. Look what's happened since then. Over the last 5 years, we've only averaged 2.3% per year. It's not just COVID. We've seen a slowdown this year. Our forecast for 2023's growth, we don't have the final number yet, is right about 2.3%. So the economy on a global basis has been growing slower than it did in the past. And this is a trend we've seen really going back to the just before COVID. This is US economic growth. And this chart isn't updated. You see we still have the third quarter number there, but you can see our estimate was correct. The US economy last year grew by 2.5%. In the fourth quarter, it grew by 3.3% on an annualized basis. That was a better result than was expected. Most economists expected growth of about 2% in the fourth quarter. In fact, it was 3.3%. And who was driving that growth? Consumers, once again. US consumers have proven that they're willing to spend no matter what. And as a result, the US economy has done much better than expected. If you remember last year at this time, a lot of economists were predicting a recession last year. In fact, of a survey of economists taken right before the new year last year, I believe it was about 60% of top-level US economists predicted a recession in 2023. It never materialized. In fact, growth was faster last year than it was in the previous year, as you can see. What about China? Now, I put in a slide for China because what's happening in China right now is definitely should be on everybody's radar. The economy in China is going through some difficult times. And you say, well, look, it grew 5.2% last year. Of course, it's a poorer country. It's likely to grow faster than the US, but that was way below expectations at the beginning of the year. China's economy is really in a period of turmoil right now. There's been a lot of uncertainty, as you can see there, a lot of unrest. The reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic in China caused a lot of consternation among Chinese consumers. The deteriorating relationship between the US and China has led to a decline in foreign investment. You may have seen that in China last year. Foreign investment declined for the first time in recent years. In fact, in the third quarter in China last year, more investment left the country than came in for the first time since Chairman Mao practically. So this is a big issue as well. And this is going to get into some of the issues we talk about when we talk about reshoring and localization and friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. Definite uncertainty in China. So if you look at the US's performance, this is average economic growth over the last 5 years. These are the world's largest wealthy economies. This is who the US should be comparing its performance against. You can see the US compares pretty favorably, near the top of the list of fastest growing wealthy economies. In fact, well above Europe, which is growing at less than 1% per year over the last 5 years, and then way above Japan, which barely grew. Although Japan did have a pretty good 2023. You think about it, Germany just released their numbers. Their economy last year shrank by 0.3%. Germany is often considered the strongest economy in Europe, and yet its economy declined last year. So we look at it in a global perspective, the US economy is doing a lot better than many people within the US would tend to believe. What about emerging markets? Again, same chart, average economic growth over the last 5 years. These are a lot lower rates than before COVID. COVID had a major impact on many emerging markets. Now, of course, some of them are still growing faster, particularly those in Asia, but the growth is not as fast as it had been before. And the big question now is, can those economies return to the levels of growth they had before COVID? Outside of Asia, the performance has been even worse. We've talked about Latin America, for example, here. Latin America has been the slowest growing region in the world over the last 10 years. It has picked up a little bit. Of note, Mexico. We talk about this return of investment to North America, a lot of it leaving China, of course. Mexico is, of course, a leading destination for that. But Mexico's economy, as you can see, has been the worst performing large emerging market over the last 10 years. Now, we're starting to see a bit of a recovery, but it remains to be seen if that recovery will continue and if it will be an investment-driven recovery. So what are some of the current risks facing the economy? Well, political, obviously. Internal and externally. Political divisions are higher than ever. We're seeing increasing political extremism on both sides of the aisle. We're seeing increasing political fragmentation in many parts of the world. This is happening both to presidential systems, such as our own, and parliamentary systems. In some parliamentary systems today, there are 18 or 19 parties in the parliament, because voters just can't decide who they're narrowing their focus. You see in that third point there. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to govern, and we have a lot of challenges that we're facing: economic, social, environmental, political, security, etc. How do we solve those challenges when our politicians are increasingly divided, increasingly fragmented, increasingly unwilling to compromise and work together? It's a big challenge. And it's not just internal political risk we're facing a huge amount of external political risk in the world today. We know what's going on in Ukraine. We're almost to the second year anniversary of the beginning of that war with no end in sight. We have a war in Gaza. We have numerous wars in Africa right now. We have unrest in many parts of the world. You see the instability in Latin America, which has led to a new surge in immigration on the US southern border, primarily coming from 4 countries: Nicaragua, Venezuela, Haiti, and right now Ecuador, which is now the new one in terms of unrest. We, of course, then have the relationship between the US and China. That's the most important one economically, but it's also the most important one for the security of the world. How the US and China get along in the coming years is going to determine, in many ways, the security of the world. And we just had an election in Taiwan a couple weeks ago where a pro-independence president was elected. William Lai was elected by a healthy margin. That will further exacerbate tensions between the US and China. So a lot going on, both internally and externally at the moment. Economically, a number of issues. Of course, you probably are experiencing this right here. Most of Ohio is labor shortages. It's very hard to find workers. You may have the best strategy, you may have the best plan, you may have the best product, but if you don't have the people to build those products, to sell those products, to market those products, it's a problem. And you can see those unemployment rates there remain incredibly low, 3.7% here in the United States. Now, labor participation is still relatively low. It's at 62.5 or 62.6% right now. That's a little bit below trend. It's mostly coming from the over 55 segment, interestingly. People ask, where are the workers? And the young people are taking the bulk of the blame for this low labor participation rate. But the labor participation rate for people between 55 and 64 is below 35% now. So in fact, a lot of people are blaming the young people. A lot of people left the workforce during COVID, a lot of people over the age of 55, and they've not returned. So that is a big problem for the economy. And so a lot of people say, well, some of that manufacturing we can send to Mexico, right? Well, look at Mexico's unemployment rate, 2.7%. Mexico has an even worse labor shortage problem than the United States has. So all this talk of reshoring and bringing manufacturing back to North America is running into one big obstacle, and that is a lack of workers. And so for labor-intensive manufacturing, this is a huge problem. Inflation, that has been another big issue, right? You remember what this chart looked like last year. Those inflation rates were a lot higher. It's come down significantly, inflation, but it's still well above central bank targets. The Fed's target is 2%. See, we're at 3.4% right now. So inflation has been coming down gradually. In some cases, maybe a little faster than expected, but you see where we are right now. But what are central banks looking at? They're not really looking at that. They're looking at core inflation. So get rid of food, get rid of energy, and that's what they're looking at. And core inflation remains a bit higher. It's at 3.9%. And the Federal Reserve, we'll talk about interest rates in a second, but that's what the Federal Reserve is looking at primarily when they're making their interest rate decisions. What is the core inflation rate? That's number one. There's also an interesting thing here to look at, and that's China again. Everybody's dealing with inflation now for a number of years. China's dealing with deflation. You remember what happened in Japan 30 years ago. They suffered deflation and it really dragged the whole economy down. Well, China now has 6 months of deflation. It's very hard to pull out of a deflationary cycle. China's in one right now, and it could get worse over time. And that spells really bad news for China. And what does that mean? What if the Chinese economy really starts struggling? What does it mean? Well, it means two things. One, China is considered the number one or number two leading export growth market for a lot of companies, a lot of US-based companies. But it also means China is going to be more aggressive economically in terms of promoting exports because their domestic market is weakening. And they're going to push investment outside of the country more aggressively because, again, just like Japan did at the same time. So this is going to lead to a major economic policy change in China, one that could impact a lot of manufacturing companies here in the US if China tries to become more aggressive in promoting exports, weakening its currency, giving other subsidies to Chinese manufacturers. It's something to watch if this deflation in China continues. But most of the world's dealing with inflation, and that has meant, of course, higher interest rates. And the question on everybody's mind is, when are interest rates going to finally come down? There are a lot of differing thoughts on this. If you saw the presentation last year, the expectation was by the end of 2023, we'd start to see the first rate cuts. But core inflation remained higher than expected. Job creation levels remained much higher than expected, and the economy performed better than expected. So all those things combined, the Fed was like, we're not cutting rates yet. We still have some concerns about inflation, and they still have those concerns. You'll see some articles in the newspaper saying, well, we'll probably see rate cuts in March, maybe April, sometime in the spring. I'm not that confident that's going to happen. I'm looking much more into the second half of 2024. The Fed wants more proof that inflation is going to be under control, that if the economy is as hot as it's been, that there's not going to be less pressure on the Fed to cut rates. So we're looking towards the second half of the year, and then you start to get into the politics of it, right? One side or the other is going to blame the Fed for either cutting rates aggressively or not cutting them at all. So the Fed's going to try and stay out of the politics of it. So it's really going to be a touchy situation in the second half of the year. And of course, many other central banks are waiting on the Fed's lead to see what it will do. But that's the big question. Watch core inflation in the next couple of months. If we see a slowdown in the US economy, and we'll talk about that coming up, that will really determine the Fed's direction in the coming months. Debt, of course, another issue. We have $34 trillion of it in this country. It's a lot. The fourth biggest, of course, we have higher interest rates now. So what is the fourth biggest expense on the federal expense now? It's paying off interest on that $34 trillion of debt. So debt is a big issue. It's going to continue to be a big issue, but it's not just public. The public sector gets most of the attention, but there's a lot of private debt concerns out there, especially outside of the US, especially in China again. China's real estate sector is facing massive debts. There are companies such as Evergrande that have debts of $320 billion by themselves, one company, $320 billion, and they can't repay it. There's a lot of companies right now, a lot of governments right now kind of teetering on the brink, needing to see higher rates of economic growth, or if in the private sector, higher revenues, but it's going to be a close call for some of them. So I had to put a few jokes in here. These there are some bad ones. Some positive news. That, again, way too negative. Consumers have saved the day. Consumers in many parts of the world continue to spend, particularly here in the United States. That's retail sales growth in 2023. Those aren't final numbers yet, so there'll be some adjustments, but those are all higher than expected. The only region where consumers have stopped spending is in Europe. Europe dealt with higher levels of inflationary pressures than the US. They have, let's say, less disposable income than US consumers, and we've seen a pretty sharp decline in retail spending in Europe. Outside of Europe, consumers spent pretty well. That really provided a needed boost for the global economy. In 2023, you saw that we expect growth fell to 2.3% globally last year. Imagine if consumers had been as pessimistic as many thought they would be. That would have been a much more serious decline last year. Where's the growth coming from? This isn't across the board growth at all. This chart on the right shows the average rate of economic growth in the US by sector. And it's no surprise that it's a couple of sectors that are really driving growth in the US, primarily the tech sector and professional services. Those two sectors are the clear drivers of growth in the United States. It's a similar situation in many other countries. Why is the US growing faster than most other rich countries? Because the US has a dominant position in those fast growth sectors, in tech, in professional services, even in arts and leisure. No surprise there. The sectors of the economy where the US is strong happen to be the sectors of the economy that are growing the fastest. And that's a lesson for companies, right? You want to be investing in those sectors that are going to grow the fastest in the coming years. You don't want to be throwing your money into sectors that don't provide you with opportunities for growth. Same is true for the economy. Too many governments around the world are investing money in sectors that are not going to provide them growth, either to keep people in jobs, to benefit their local voting constituencies, whatever it may be. New technologies also right now having a huge impact, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a little bit. But of course, the key word or the key term of 2023 was AI. Artificial intelligence is undoubtedly the key term of 2023. It's transforming the economy. We'll talk about that later, but there are many others as well. The metaverse, green technology, automation, all of these things are having a big impact right now on all sectors of the economy. So if your business is looking right now, how do we succeed right now? What do you have to do? Well, first, you have to identify the immediate threats to your business. What are your current threats? What economic trends, technological trends, market trends are going to impact my business right now? And then reduce your exposure to high risk, low growth segments of the market. And then identify the right opportunities, the opportunities that present themselves now, and focus your resources on those opportunities. That's the here and now. That's where we are, January 2024, here in Dover, Ohio. But what's going to be happening in the next couple of years? We'll look at the near-term outlook. By near-term, I mean 2024 to 2026. We are expecting a slowdown. We're expecting a slowdown here in the US, not a major one, but a slowdown this year. And we're expecting another slowdown in the global economy in 2024. This will be a challenging year. But we do expect growth to start picking up again in 2025 and 2026. Many of the factors I just talked about, from inflation to interest rates to debt, they're going to continue to be issues over the near term. They're things that are not going to go away overnight. So you can see our forecast now. This is our forecast for global economic growth. We're expecting to go from 2.3 to 2.1%. So that'll be the worst year outside of COVID for the economy since the financial crisis. And then a recovery to 2.7 and 2.6% in 2025 and 2026. What's interesting to note there, the economy globally was growing at 3.5% before COVID consistently. And now we're looking closer at 2.5%. So there's definitely a slowdown, and there's a number of reasons for that, particularly China's slowdown, but many other emerging market slowdowns as well. What about the US? We're forecasting 1.6% growth in the US this year. That is a slowdown from last year. That's kind of in line. Some major economists are a little bit lower, in fact. A couple have been notoriously higher. A couple are around 2%. But anyway, we feel pretty comfortable at the moment about 1.6, and then rebounding to 1.9 and 2.4. That is a relatively optimistic outlook when you compare the US to other, well, I'll get to that in a second. Well, I'll skip back to China. You can see we actually forecast the US economy to grow faster over the next 3 years than any other rich country in the world. Europe's going to recover to a degree, a little more than 1% growth. Japan going back to its sluggish ways at 0.3%. So when we compare ourselves to our peers, it looks pretty good. I mean, this isn't the growth rate of the past, as you remember, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but comparatively, the US is doing better than many of its peers. Now, what about China? Now, these are maybe a little bit optimistic forecasts, but we expect the Chinese economy to grow about 4% roughly per year over the next 3 years. Again, the numbers that come out of China, you've heard me say this before, they're kind of made up. But there are ways of measuring how the Chinese economy is doing. You look at freight, you look at electricity usage, you look at what's going on in the ports, and you can get an idea of the true health of the economy. China's economy has kept growing because of manufacturing. Consumer spending in China is now forecast to fall. The real estate sector in China, which is really, I mentioned some of the problems they have, is expected to really be a drag on consumer spending. We expect China to be very aggressive in manufacturing and promoting exports. So you're going to see a very aggressive China in the coming years, and this will allow the economy to keep growing, albeit at a slower pace. And we'll talk about China's longer-term future going forward. You may have seen this in the news the other day. China's population, we'll talk about demographics a bit later. China's population shrank by over 2 million people last year, 2.09. Imagine that's like almost all of Northeast Ohio just disappearing. So part of it was COVID because they opened the market. They finally opened up after locking everybody inside for 3 years. And a lot of people caught COVID, but they have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. They have no immigration. So their population is just going to shrink and shrink over time. And their working age population, their young population is going to continue to decline. As you can see then, China is now being overtaken by many other Asian emerging markets in terms of growth. And a lot of companies who invested in, especially in manufacturing in China, are increasingly looking at neighbors, Vietnam, in India, other parts of Southeast Asia, because of the political concerns, because of the lack of a labor force. All of these things are really starting to have a big impact on the Chinese economy. Elsewhere, growth will be slower in emerging markets. We'll talk about the regions a little bit. We expect Latin America about 2%, Central Europe about 2.5%, Middle East closer to 3%, all depending upon oil prices. But these are all growth rates that are lower than they were before COVID, with the exception perhaps of India and a couple Southeast Asian economies. So even emerging markets are struggling to grow as fast as they used to. Oh, some more risks. Here we go. What are some of the risks? We have an election this year. How many people are looking forward to that race? The combined age of the two candidates will be about 160. It is going to be a tumultuous wait. My concern at the race is not, I think it's going to be the months ahead of time. I think if we have an election, and regardless of which way it goes, and if the dust settles and it's accepted, fine. I think those months before the election are going to breed some uncertainty, particularly as the race could. Right now, you can see in some of these are the 8 swing states. We don't even include Ohio as a swing state anymore. We see that former President Trump has a lead over current President Biden in 6 of the 8, and then 2 of them are extremely close. Obviously, there's a lot of time to go before the election. When you have 2 presidents, I hate to say this, with a combined age of 100, 2 candidates with a combined age of 160, the chances that one of them doesn't make it to the finish line is a real problem. And I'm not just, it could be incapacitation, defenestration, incarceration, could be anything. But there's a real chance that one of the 2 is not there. And what is going to happen? Both parties are not prepared. Both parties have put themselves in a position where they have put all their cards in the two candidates' hands. We have a very uncertain situation, and this could lead to some uncertainty coming up to the election. And then again, if it is a close contested election, as most of our elections are these days, what will happen thereafter remains a very big issue. So this is something that the entire world is watching, and this could lead to a slowdown in investment activity. Businesses may decide, we're going to wait and see what happens here, because we do not know what's going to happen in this November election, particularly if the polls are relatively close and we're getting closer to November and there's not a clear front runner. So this is definitely something that could have an impact, not just on the US, but all around the world. And that could lead to a fall in foreign investment into the United States as well. The US has been attracting so much foreign investment in recent years. We'll show that later, but the US is in is receiving an absolute surge of foreign investment in recent years. That could slow down as well, as due to uncertainty over this election. And it's not just the US that's voting this year. Countries and territories with a population of 4.2 billion people are going to the polls this year, most in human history. A couple of those elections have already happened, Bangladesh and Taiwan, but look at some of the other major countries and economies that are going to be holding elections this year. So it's not just the US one has all the, of course, attention, but there are a lot of major economies that are going to be holding elections. Some of these elections will be fair, some of them will not be. I'm looking at Russia and Venezuela. But it's going, Iran for that matter. Bangladesh wasn't fair. But it's going to be an interesting year. Some of these are also going to be test cases for our election. A lot of people are concerned about fake news, AI created fake news, whatever it may be. Watch these other elections, see what's happening there, and then imagine what could happen in our election going forward. This is going to be a very challenging year for democracy. More people are voting than ever before in human history. And at the same time, we are facing some real challenges as far as the democratic form of government. And those issues, like I said, polarization, extremism, fragmentation, it's not just in the US, it's happening all around the world. And we'll see many examples of that well before we get to our election in November. It's not just politics, of course. Well, it's not just internal politics, it's also external. We still have all of those risks I talked about are still in place. What's going to happen in Ukraine? How is that war going to end? It's a stalemate now. The front lines have barely moved for months. The death toll keeps rising. The questions about supporting Ukraine in the West continue to mount. In Russia continues to pour resources into that conflict to no avail. They've lost, nobody knows exactly how much because they're not clear, but they've lost a huge amount of men and material, or personnel and material. Major risks geopolitically. So it's internal risk and external risk. The labor shortage issue isn't going away. I've told you this in the last couple of years as well. This isn't a COVID phenomenon. This is now here to stay. Labor shortages are going to be a real problem. That's a change in working age population just over the next 3 years. That's a much lower increase than we had in the past. And for some big economies, they're already declining. So learning to live with labor shortages is going to be a key factor. Of course, automation, robotics are going to help to offset some of that in some industries, but not others can't. Others won't be able to have that benefit. Productivity. Now, we haven't talked about productivity yet, but there's a little bit of good news here. You've heard me say this in the past. The only way our economy is going to grow is if we're more productive. And productivity had been declining for 50 years. There was a little bit of an uptick during the IT revolution, but in general, productivity has been collapsing. People thought during the information revolution that productivity would boom, but people just played solitaire and made TikTok videos in their office. But we're starting to see the latest productivity numbers in the US are tremendous, like really surprisingly positive. And perhaps this AI revolution and all these other technologies are finally solving the riddle we need to solve if we're going to grow the economy long term, and that is increasing productivity. So perhaps finally, and it's one quarter. The second quarter wasn't bad. Third quarter was really good, but it is a sign of hope, because we do need to be more productive. You need to be more productive in your businesses. Your county needs to be more productive. Our country needs to be more productive. That's the only way we're going to generate growth over the long term. So it's some positive news there. Debt, of course, still a problem. It's not going to go away. Debt's going to continue to be a problem. Our expenditures are going to be a real issue going forward. How do we deal with that? Right now, politically, there is absolutely no progress in this. both sides are going to have to make a compromise here. We can't cut spending and work our way out of this crisis. At the same time, we can't raise taxes and work our way out of this crisis. There has to be a compromise somewhere. The economy, as you can see, is going to grow 2% per year. That's our forecast. That's not where we used to be. We're not going to grow our way out, but at the same time, we're not going to cut our way out. So both sides of the political aisle are going to have to make some compromises here. The climate. We haven't talked about the climate yet. It was the warmest year in history in 2023. This year is forecast to be the warmest year again, breaking the records. An El Nino in the Pacific, so temperatures are supposed to go up. What's the good news? Companies, of course, are being forced now to, when they're making a big investment, take the climate and the environment into consideration. The good news is we live in what is considered the most climate change resilient part of the world. The Great Lakes region is considered the region in the world most resilient to climate change. We have the water. Unless you've been hit by a tornado, we don't have natural disasters. We have the land, we have wind, we have all kinds of advantages to attract businesses to this region. That, imagine we're competing with Arizona and Florida for an investment. And the investors are saying, you better have an environmental plan if we're going to approve that investment. We say, hey, Ohio clearly has a major advantage over those locations. Now, we might not have the workers to fill those jobs that they invest here, but it is a real opportunity for this region because this change is certainly coming. So what about some of the opportunities on top of those opportunities? Climate change, it's a threat to the global economy, obviously, but it is an opportunity for this region. We expect inflation to continue to come down. That's our inflation forecast for the end of 2024. So almost back to the target. We're forecasting inflation to be about 2.5% by the end of the year. So almost back to the target. If we're there and the economy slows like we're predicting, you'll start to see a couple of we're predicting, to be honest, 25% basis point rate cuts before the end of the year, and then bigger rate cuts in after the election into 2025. Just to be clear, but inflation looking like it's going to come down. But there are some risks for spikes. You've seen what's happening in terms of supply chains. Shipping costs have gone back up, 130% increase for some parts of the world since the Houthi rebels in Yemen started firing missiles at container ships in the Red Sea, and since the Panama Canal is in the middle of a drought. So shipping costs are going back up. We're not expecting them to go back up like they were during the height of COVID, but there's some threat there. And if things like that happen, inflation won't come down quite as quickly as foreseen. But this is right now our forecast for about 2.5% inflation by the end of the year. Interest rates, as you can see, we factored in 25 basis point cuts, three of them, 25 basis point cuts, easy for me to say. Other central banks will start to follow suit going forward. We'll start to see rate cuts towards the latter part of the year. The bigger rate cuts will come 2025 is our expectation. But this is a long process. You see what it's done to the real estate market. The real estate market's not going to bounce back overnight. People are not willing to sell in such an environment. Prices remain relatively high, so it's going to be a gradual, long recovery for the real estate market as well. 2023 was the worst year in terms of sales. I believe it was since 1995. I think it's the worst year since then. It was really a difficult year for the real estate market. Reshoring. Now, this has been a big issue for Ohio, obviously. I mentioned there's been a huge surge in foreign investment in recent years into the U.S. Foreign companies are concerned they're going to be locked out of the U.S. market because of protectionism. The one thing that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on is a more protectionist economic policy. So a lot of a lot of companies from outside of the U.S. have been investing here, fearful they're going to be left out of these massive infrastructure contracts and whatnot. So there's been an absolute surge. Now, China, which had been attracting about almost as much in foreign investment as the U.S., has seen the opposite, a huge decline in foreign investment over the last 18 months or so. So different trends going on there. The rest of the world somewhat down. But of course, it's all well and good. We're getting this investment, but do we have the labor force to meet that investment? Labor shortages, infrastructure, those are issues that continue to constrain some of the reshoring activity, some of the friendshoring activity of investment coming back into the U.S. The labor one is the big one, of course. I speak at Ohio State most years, and I asked them about the Intel investment, and I asked them how involved were they, and they said they were completely involved. Intel wanted assurances that they were going to have a workforce in place if they were going to invest all that money in New Albany. It's a real important issue. So when you're trying to attract investment here, that's the question you're going to get. the most, is how do you have the people in place if we choose to invest there? And it's a challenge all across Ohio, across the Midwest, across there's a major investment in Phoenix I was just reading about outside of Phoenix, and they're having problems. Fine, and that's a place where the population has been growing rapidly. So this is a real issue going forward. We are in an era where population growth is slowing, as you've heard me say many times, and now we're attracting all this investment. Companies need workers. Do we have the workers in place? That's the big question. I talked about productivity already. Will this productivity rebound that we saw last year continue? If it does, those economic growth forecasts will go up, because that's really the key. Our demographic situation is not good. Trade and investment, at least in the US, has been positive, but in other parts of the world, not so good. But if we can boost productivity, it's going to change our economic outlook going forward. All of these technologies, and these are just 10, there are so many more, are going to impact your businesses going forward. Obviously, AI is the most important one. There was a recent study just came out of Stanford. They listed the 20 fastest growing jobs over the next 5 years. 19 of them were AI related. 19 out of 20. If your business doesn't understand, if you have no one in your business that understands AI, hire somebody. Get somebody in your business right now who understands what it can do for your business, how it's going to transform your business, your industry, how your competitors are doing it. It's going to transform everything in the economy. So if you don't have someone now, find someone. There are young people coming out of university who are now specializing in this. Bring somebody on board who can at least explain to you the benefits and the threats that AI is going to provide. I had an article in Crane's magazine a few months ago about how the labor force is going to be transformed by AI. Think about some of the jobs that could disappear. Bookkeeping, legal research, market research, economic speakers. I have some robots standing up here giving an interesting speech. It is really going to change. And for a lot of people early in their careers in particular, this could have a major transformative effect. Let's just take one example. Imagine you're studying law. What do lawyers do when they get hired? They do the grunt work. They do the research. They do all the background work for the lawyers working on the big cases. AI can do that in a fraction of a second. So how do you then become a lawyer and then move up in a law firm if you don't have that opportunity to start off at the ground floor? It's a real challenge. So what are the safest jobs? Jobs you work with your hands. AI is not replacing them yet. Wait till robots come along, but they're down here. But those right now are the safest jobs. There's going to be a complete transformation of the workforce. Look at it this way, 60% of the jobs that exist today did not exist in 1940. And now probably within 30 years, there's going to be an entire new class of jobs and other jobs that make up a big share of our workforce, especially on the white collar side, won't be there. They'll be completely changed. So this is transformative, and it's not just AI. I mean, AI is getting all the attention. Things like quantum computing, for example, have the opportunity, the potential to change things. 3D printing, 6G, all of these things. We are in an era of unprecedented technological change, and it is absolutely transforming many industries, many businesses, our entire economy. So having people in your company that at least understand how this is going to impact your business is important. You need to have an understanding, because your competitors, some of your competitors they're using AI, they're adapting AI for all different types of activities within their business. You need to be on top of that as well. So how do you succeed in this coming world? We talked about how you succeed right now. How do you succeed over the next 2 or 3 years? Again, understanding the technology is right at the top of the list. You need to have someone inside your business or someone who's at least advising your business who can help you to understand these technological changes. Identify the main near-term risks to your business and be able to protect your business from sudden change. We had a great example of that during COVID. We had our clients, we always send them something at the beginning of the year saying, these are your risks. And we would always say every year, there's a 2 to 3% risk of a pandemic. Because there was, if you look historically, there's a 2 to 3% chance there's going to be a pandemic in any given year. And it finally came in 2020. But most businesses were caught unprepared for that. So be prepared for potential sudden changes. It could be a technological change. It could be geopolitical conflict. It could be another election catastrophe, whatever it may be. Be prepared for it. And then at the same time, don't just be preparing for risk, be preparing for opportunities as well. Identify those markets that are going to give you the best opportunity for growth in the coming years. Invest in those sectors. Don't throw money in the sectors that aren't going to provide growth. Throw money into the sectors that are going to provide growth and accumulate the resources you need to take advantage of the opportunities. We often talk about how businesses prepare themselves to avoid risk, but how many businesses have missed opportunities because they don't have the resources in place when those opportunities arise? Many. So be prepared not just for risk and for threats to your business, but for sudden opportunities for growth. We're in a period of dramatic change. Those opportunities are going to present themselves faster than you may expect. So we've looked at what's going on today. We looked at what's going to go on over the next couple of years. What's going to go on over the next, let's say, 20 years? Here in the US, when we do, if you read a US annual report, it's really focused on the here and now. If you read a Japanese or South Korean annual report, they're talking about what's going to happen in 2075. So they're looking long term. So we're not going to go that far. We're going to look the next 20 years. What's going to happen in the world? Well, unless productivity really comes up, generating economic growth is going to become more difficult. Less people in the workforce, changes in trade and investment. Demographic decline is going to accelerate. The labor shortages we deal with now are nothing compared to the labor shortages potentially in the future. The era of a globalized world is turning into an era of a fragmented, regionalized world, which we're seeing increasingly. And then, of course, it's all coming down to technological and productivity breakthroughs over the longer term. So this is our forecast of annual growth rates per year, but by decade. You've seen similar charts before. The global economy has significantly slowed. We were at about 3% per year for about a 40-year period. We're now looking at about 2.3% on average over the next 20 years. That goes all the way 30 years. So that's almost 30 years. It's a slower growth. Finding growth is going to be a little harder than it used to be in the past. So identifying the growth markets is going to be important. That's the same chart, but for the US. And see, the US, as you've seen me talk about before, 2 generations ago was growing over 4% per year. A generation ago, 3% per year. And in the 21st century so far, 2% per year. And we're looking at growth falling to about 1.6, 1.7%. The US has a couple big advantages: geographic advantages, demographic advantages, being in a strong presence in high tech and high growth sectors. So that's actually a much better number than we're predicting for European economies, for economies like Japan. The US economy, it's going to slow, but it's going to do better than most of them. Again, it's all coming down to productivity. That's going to be the deciding factor. Kind of like the Browns quarterback, right? That's going to decide if the Browns can go further or not. Talk about throwing good money after bad. $230 million. These are our forecast economic growth rates for the next 20 years per year. And you can see, again, the US compares favorably to the world's wealthier countries, but all of them are growing at a slower pace. Unless there's an absolute technological change that drives productivity through the roof, it's going to be very hard for a lot of these economies to generate growth as their markets start to shrink. Their population decline continues. For many of those economies, they don't do well in high-tech sectors. Why is Italy, for example, always near the bottom here? Because they're not doing well, and they don't invest much in high-tech, high-growth sectors. So that's been an absolute problem for that relatively large economy. As far as emerging markets are concerned, what you're looking for there, India growing almost 6% per year over the next 20 years. India, of course, is quite still a relatively poor country. Its per capita GDP is only 40% of that of China, only 12% of that of the United States. So India is still a relatively poor country. China, about 3% per year. And that could prove to be optimistic if this deflationary trap really takes hold like it did in Japan. There's a real chance that China's economic growth falls even further. Now, China has done things differently than Japan. Japan was a very specialized economy. China is mass producing a lot of manufactured goods that should still allow it to export, but that's a big change. China just 2 generations ago was growing 10% year after year. Just before COVID, it was 7% per year. Now we're down to 5%. We're forecasting 4%, and we're now looking at 3% over the next 20 years. So a major slowdown. What does that mean? That means China is not going to overtake the US as the largest economy in this forecast period. A lot of people were predicting that by now, or at least in this decade, China would be the largest economy in the world. That's not on the cards anymore. So, yeah. And you see some of the other forecasts we have. Latin America, about 2% per year. We haven't talked about Africa. Africa is the one region in the world where the population is growing. You've heard me say this before, 1 billion extra people will live in Africa by the year 2050. So while there's a lack of workers in most parts of the world, Africa is going to have 1 billion extra people within less than a generation. It needs infrastructure investment. It needs stability. But it is a region that has the potential to attract some investment, particularly in low-end manufacturing processes. You think about how China went from a low-end manufacturing center to a more high-end one. Does Africa follow suit there? That's a big question. Or will automation simply make it a moot point? That's the other question. You've seen this chart before. I put it on my slides. This is why companies in the US are investing abroad. Again, blue line is economic growth in the rich world, developed economies, if you will. The red line is emerging markets. You've seen what's happened. Growth has slowed in the rich world. It picked up in the emerging markets in the 21st century, mostly in Asia, but they're both starting to slow now. Asia is still going to provide the bulk of economic growth. 50% of additional economic output in the world today comes from Asia. That's not going to change over the near term, but less of it's going to come from China. More of it's going to come from India and Southeast Asia. What are some of the risks? This political, even when this election is over. Remember, the last couple of elections were like, oh, it's over, finally. Here we are again. Do we really think 2028 or 2032 or 2036 is going to be all that much better? This is a real problem. Fragmentation, polarization is continuing to take hold. Democracy really is going to be challenged in the coming years by these trends. And again, I'm not placing blame on any one side. This is really across the political spectrum, but we do have more and more people looking out at their narrow interest and not looking at the big interest of the country, of their society, looking more at what this is the issue I'm focused on, and everything else comes thereafter. And that's really causing a challenge in the modern world. And then think about AI and all the misinformation possibilities out there. So really some big threats to democracy going forward. Same thing geopolitically. There's really little prospect for a decline in geopolitical risk over the long term. We are living in an era of heightened risk. That's going to continue, especially as the world becomes more fragmented, more multipolar. Even with the US doing as well as it's doing and being the preeminent power in the world, it has no way, there's no way the US can manage to police the entire world in the future. It's just becoming there are too many conflicts. It will be a very big challenge to maintain stability over the longer term. Demographic change. Imagine now, you've heard me say this before, that your business is focused on young consumers. Well, your market's shrinking. Look at in some countries, it's shrinking dramatically. That's the decline in the population, or the change, I should say, in the population of under 18s in each country. Here in the US, we'll have almost 3% less people under the age of 18 by the year. What do I have? 2044. So imagine you're a university, for example. Your potential market is declining. But look at what's happening outside of the US. See, it's much worse. China is having, in China, it's absolutely remarkable how fast their youth population is going to decline. But it's happening in almost every major economy. So this is a real challenge. If your market is people under the age of 18, your market's going to shrink. What about working age population? That's between 18 and 65. Look what's going to happen in some of the world's biggest economies. The world's second, third, and fourth largest economies are all going to see their working age population shrink by more than 12%. That's a huge decline. It's not just the working age, it's not just the labor side. This is a big market. These are the people who spend a lot of money. They buy houses, they buy cars, they buy clothes, whatever it may be. The market's shrinking just naturally. In the US, we have a relatively favorable position. We'll grow by 4.6% our working age population, mostly due to immigration, because our birth rate has fallen to 1.6. You know that the average, if you have no immigration, I've said this before, the average woman has to have 2.1 babies and your population doesn't change. Well, our birth rate has fallen to 1.6. That's the lowest it's been in a long, long time. Other parts of the world, it's below 1. South Korea last year, 0.78. The average woman in South Korea has zero. I don't know what a 0.78 baby looks like, but they're having less than 1 baby. It's happening in Japan. It's happening in China. And this trend is continuing. Just because the birth rate now has fallen to 1.6 doesn't mean that's the bottom. I mean, it's fallen sharply in recent years. Some people thought it was COVID. Perhaps not. Perhaps there's going to be a long-term trend towards people having less children. And that really spells environmentally, you can argue it's great for the planet, but from an economic standpoint, it's a big challenge. Regionalization is continuing. The fragmentation in the different parts of different regions is continuing, and it's going to look maybe something like this in the future, where you've got a Chinese-led East Asian region with some countries that are not so friendly with China. You've got a North American, a Latin American region. This is a possibility. We're seeing this trend starting to take hold in many parts of the world. Long-term debt. Anyone think the debt problem is going away? Of course not. It's just going to get worse. We have more people are living longer. Our expenditures on people over the age of 65 is going up. If interest rates remain high, our interest on debt is going to continue to go up. And if growth rates are slower in the future, there will be a reckoning at some point, either on the public side or the private side or both. We've seen this happen in some weaker economies already. We've had debt crises in Argentina, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, but this is something that can continue for some time to come. The climate change is going to continue. Most scientists will say that. How we adapt to that is going to be a major issue. Some parts of the world are really going to face some massive economic and human costs through climate change if the current trends continue. And those are some major economic centers we're thinking about. The long-term prospects are even more dire, but certainly over the next 20 years, we're going to see. Cleveland, we saw it here last year. Cleveland was the most polluted city in the world for 2 days. We had the worst air pollution in the world in Cleveland, thanks to our Canadian friends. We had higher rates of air pollution than Karachi, Pakistan, Delhi, India, the most polluted cities in the world. We were the most polluted city for a couple days last year. This is happening. What about some opportunities? Well, new technologies and processes. It's really coming down. Can we drive growth with new technologies and new processes? That would drive higher rates of productivity. At the same time, health-related technology. I haven't talked about this really, but right now there's been this long-term assumption that when you get to a certain age, that's the end of your productive life. Well, technology in healthcare is changing. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Now, try telling people they have to work longer, and good luck being reelected. But it holds the possibility of extending the productive lives of many parts of our population. Technology is obviously going to create new sectors of the economy. I mentioned the Stanford study. 19 of the 20 fastest growing jobs are all AI related. Those didn't exist a couple of years ago. It's going to completely transform the economy. It's going to create new sectors. You look at what's driving the US economy today. How many of those businesses that are leading those sectors existed 30 or 40 years ago? Very few of them. So there's going to be new sectors, new businesses that arise that will help drive growth in the future. There's going to be new markets. While some of the traditional markets are declining in terms of population, there are going to be markets right now that are not important to your business that could be in the future. Those are the forecasts of the largest countries in the world by population in 2050. And you can see a lot of those countries you probably do very little business with at the moment. The elderly, the over 65, segment of the market is growing. So if your business is in healthcare, in cruise lines, in anything that over 65s like to buy, your market's growing dramatically. And this is a real opportunity because there's a lot of wealth in this segment of the market, an increasing amount of wealth. And so if your business isn't focused on this segment of the market, you might want to be focused on the segment. And if it is, you have some tremendous possibilities for growth going forward. It is, of course, also a major risk for government finances. Our spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is 3.5 trillion, 3.6 trillion, it's a massive number. And it's just going up and up and up. So how do you succeed over the long term? We've talked about how do you succeed now, how do you succeed over the next couple of years. Again, technology, being on top of long-term technological trends is absolutely important. Diversify your business away from sectors of the economy that are going to decline or forecast to decline. If you are looking at your business and you're looking 10 years down the road and it's clear demand is going to go down, you need to start diversifying while you have the opportunity. Educate yourself on the upcoming changes, what's going to be happening. That's what you're all doing here today, right? You're educating yourself, knowing what these changes are coming, how do we be proactive and prepare for them. Again, identifying opportunities for growth is so important in any business, preparing your business to grow and having the accumulated knowledge and resources to take advantage of those changes. It's over. You've survived another 17th presentation of this. I'm happy to take any questions. Obviously, this is, again, I put this up every time. I see that we'll get to you in a second. This is my contact information. If anyone has any questions or if you want to talk about how these things are affecting your business specifically, you can reach me by email or by phone. You can see our websites. That's a good ringtone. I like that one. But if there's any questions right now, I'd be happy to take them. I don't know, how long did I even speak for? I didn't even keep time. 1 hour, wow. All right.
Mike, one of the fastest growing things for organizations I'm involved with is the spikes in cost of insurance. What do you see happening there?
That's not going to change. That's definitely not going to change. We've had a huge spike in insurance. There's been a major increase in insurance costs in recent years. That's some of the, especially when you look at the climate-related insurance spikes. Yeah, that's going to be a real issue, and we're going to see if the government is going to be forced to intervene at some point, because it's going to really become a major problem.
Too big to fail, ever come back.
Right. Right. Yes.
What about hacking? What about the sabotage with people hacking and attacks of utilities, and it's going on all over the world?
Yeah, that's a serious concern, and it was a major concern when the war in Ukraine broke out that we might see something. We didn't really see it from there, but should those geopolitical tensions continue to be exacerbated, that's going to be one of the first things we would see, is a major increase in that. It can take a relatively minor power on the state stage, on the global stage. All they need to do is be able to get into the electrical grid or whatever it may be. So yeah, companies are investing huge amounts of money in protecting themselves, but it's a huge risk, and it's just going to become bigger and bigger.
Hospitals pay huge sums to get their system.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I'm recalling my history correctly, we started tracking GDP growth during or after World War II. And if my memory is correct, during the Eisenhower years, we saw some growth rates, 6-7%.
Yeah.
Okay, and based on what you've shown us today, over the next, say, 5 years, what would be a GDP growth rate that people could actually brag about? As you pointed out, the bigger the economy gets, the tougher it is to achieve high growth.
Yeah, 2.5% is braggable in this world right now. It really is. When you compare to Germany minus 0.3, France about 1, UK near 0, Canada significantly lower. So 2.5 is pretty high. There was, when in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, he promised 4% growth. And economists, we all looked at you, that's not possible. Even you can cut taxes all you want, you're not going to get in them. It's just impossible. There's what you call the growth ceiling. It's based on your demographic situation, the position where your economy is in the world. If we hit 3% any year, which we haven't done, as you saw from that chart, we came close many years. We got to 2.5% this year. That's a tremendous year for an economy like the US without a major boost in productivity. It's just not possible. Every economy has a ceiling that it's almost impossible to go above. Ours used to be, after World War II, yeah, it was 8%. Then it got to about 4.5%. During the Clinton administration, it was near 3.5%, and it's come down. Now it's maximum 3%. Anything above that is just off the charts right now.
What impact is the open border and the 8+ million new migrants going to have on this country?
Well, it's going to have a big impact. The problem, it has some negative problems, because we need immigration, clearly. We are lacking workers in so many sectors of the economy, whether it's agricultural, whether it's tech, whatever it may be. But it does breed anti-immigration sentiment then when they see masses of immigrants crossing the border. So you get a backlash, which makes it more difficult to bring the immigrants you need into the country. At the same time, there's a real potential, because we've heard a lot. If let's say Donald Trump is elected, there's been talk of sending troops into Mexico to go after drug traffickers and human traffickers. So the geopolitical tensions could be higher. So you want to control the border. At the same time, we want to attract those immigrants who are going to build businesses, create jobs, pay taxes, settle down in this country, become US citizens. But rushes to the border, like we've seen in the last few months, breed that anti-immigration sentiment. And we get where we are right now. Immigration is going to be perhaps the number one issue in this election. I mean, even with all the economic issues we've talked about, all the political issues, immigration may well be the biggest vote determinant in November.
Is that going to be a benefit or a negative because of the, say, the quality of the immigrant we're dealing with?
Yeah, we are getting immigrants at the moment who are largely lower skilled. And we need, I mean, our agricultural sector is desperate for people to work in it. But it's, I don't want to say the wrong thing. It is, yeah, I know. We want to keep masses of people coming from, every time there's a crisis in their country, we don't want everybody flooding into this country. So in Venezuela, everyone's been crossing through the Darien Gap in Panama, coming up north, because their economies collapsed. They don't feel there's going to be a political change. Haiti, which I don't know if you've seen the news about Haiti, it's complete anarchy, more than usual right now. Ecuador, which was a little more stable. Ecuador has just gone into total anarchy in the last few weeks. I taught a class up at Walden Wallace last semester. I had 3 Ecuadorian students, and they were all extremely concerned about, you know, the future of their country. So we don't want to have to deal with that kind of rush of migration, because it takes away from the migration we're trying to attract, but it's going to be an inevitable result of unrest in that region. And unfortunately, when you look at Latin America right now, you look at some of those countries, the potential for more unrest is really high. Places like Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia may slip back into some higher degree. And we're even now seeing at the southern border, the focus has been on those 4 countries, but there was a surge in immigrants coming from China, India, and Russia in the last couple of months. There were Russians coming to avoid being drafted. There were 42,000 Russians who crossed into the US over the last few months, mostly to avoid going to war, the fight in Ukraine.
Why is the Mexican unemployment rate so much lower?
Because there's been so many jobs created, and their birth rate is also falling. There's an assumption that Latin America's population is exploding. It's not. Latin America's birth rate has fallen as much as ours. So this is a sort of a temporary thing. In 40 years, we're not going to be talking about surges of immigration from Latin America, because their working age population is also declining. In Mexico, in fact, there's been some Mexican immigration this year, but if you measure it over the last 20 to 25 years, it's almost even the number of Mexicans who go back to Mexico and those who come here. So we almost have it's a net zero almost. It's coming from countries that are more unstable. So the unemployment rate in Mexico, there's been so much manufacturing investment, and those create jobs. And so 2.7%, it's a real problem. The unemployment rate in parts of northern Mexico is below 2% in many places, which is just way too tight of a labor market.
If all those immigrants are coming through Mexico, why isn't Mexico trying to retain those?
They've had programs to attempt to keep some, but most immigrants are determined to make it further north. So yeah, no, there have been efforts to, especially for Spanish-speaking immigrants, to have them stay in Mexico, but there's a determination to make it to the U.S. border.
Michael, you had a bullet point on commodity prices. Been watching the price of uranium, which has gone from $47 to $106.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of factors in that. One was Russia, the war in Ukraine, which is a big source, and the other is Niger, which of course there was a coup, and they kicked the French out. They haven't kicked the U.S. out yet. The U.S. has a big drone base in Niger, but that's one of the world's leading sources of uranium. So there's a major concern there will be reductions in exports of uranium, because the Wagner group from Russia is very active now there. So that's a big factor as well. So yeah. Didn't expect to talk about Niger today, did we? That's the second question on that I've had this week.
So locally, I'm involved in housing, rental properties, whatnot. Locally, I've been hearing a lot that there's a housing shortage, that we need more houses. And yet, maybe frustrated with, if I were to build a duplex or a triplex or something bigger, I'd have to charge way beyond what the rent is now to make that project make sense. And if it doesn't make sense to me, I'm not going to go to the banker and say, hey, give me some money, I want to go build something. And he's going to look at me and say, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
So what advice would you have to solving the housing problem, if you will, to attract more workers to the area with some of the businesses that are coming to the area?
Let me ask you a question, because that's very interesting. If let's say some major manufacturer decides to set up shop here, how bad would the housing shortage be right now? Terrible here. And you're saying that even if you wanted to build all this housing, you would not have it wouldn't be financially interesting for you.
Because of inflation.
Right.
You know, it's just.
Cost per square foot, you couldn't get it there.
Right. That's a really interesting point. I don't know what advice I could actually give you there, because what we tell governments is you need to have the housing in place if you want to attract the businesses, you want to attract the young people that you're going to have work there. And you're saying rightfully it's not really financially sensible right now.
Our main home builder here says he cannot build a house. He cannot make money on a house less than $300,000, which is pretty expensive for this area and leaves out a whole.
And you're trying to attract young workers to a place. I mean, you see that in the bigger cities where they're building townhomes and larger apartments and condos and this. And yeah, they're charging way more than you would have expected for a city like Cleveland, for example. So you're saying here it's an even greater problem then. So that's an interesting point, because we're trying to attract all this investment to the state. We struggle with we don't have the available labor, and then to attract the people here, we don't have the housing for them. And one of our big selling points is the cost of living is so low here. If you're growing up in New York or Washington or whatever, and you could come here and save a lot, you're saying, yeah, you can come here, make decent money, and save a lot of that money. But you're saying you're not going to be able to sell a house for under $300,000 to be profitable. Yeah, that's a real challenge. And
You end up with more communities.
right. And so that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Mike, what's going to happen with food insecurity? You talk about 1 billion more people in Africa.
Yeah, it's a very big issue. That's why we've seen inflation go down in most parts of the world, but in certain places, particularly Africa and this year India, food prices have really gone up again. Last year they spiked because of the cutoff of grain and fertilizer from Russia and Ukraine, and now there's been other issues as well. So food insecurity is going to be a very big issue in some parts of the world. It's a real opportunity for our agricultural sector. We have the real opportunity to export a lot, because even a lot of those countries where the population is growing do not have the capacity to grow their own food. The land is poor in many places. They just don't have. We have some of the best land on earth in this part of the world, and most of those countries where the population growth is going to occur has some of the worst land. So it's a very big issue.
I read an article recently that talked about how, again, looking back, my father was in middle management in the 90s. This not the average salary, but he had a $50,000 salary in the early 90s. The equivalent today is around 115. I don't know if that's what you see mathematically, if that sounds right. But the problem is that there's by far, much less people making $115,000 a year versus people who are making $50,000, $60,000 in the early 90s. So the spending power of the consumers become a problem. As in management, when you're looking at salaries, you see that there's been a whittling down to the middle class, but now you see consumer spending's up, and you see that the employment rate is down. Do you see a revitalization of the middle class? Do you see employers having to pay more salaries? Is that something that is a forecasted thing in the
definitely.
next 20 years?
Well, certainly workers are going to be empowered in those segments that aren't wiped out by AI, at least. I do expect to see some pretty healthy wage growth in certain sectors of the economy, whereas, like you said, there hasn't been in recent decades. So I do see an opportunity in some of those for growth. A lot of that consumer spending has been driven by what? There's a lot of money put into the economy during COVID. That's coming to an end. Stock market was up 24% last year. That helped drive consumer spending as well. We're not forecasting 24% stock market growth this year. That's a very good point, that the consumer spending growth is not followed wage growth in many sectors. And so our forecast is that the labor market is going to continue to be tight, which is going to give some power to people looking at wages to go up. And at the same time, consumer spending to moderate somewhat. So I think there's going to be a little bit of a rebalancing. But you're right, middle management meant something different 30 years ago. than it does now in terms of salary. It's completely changed. Salary expectations have changed completely. When you look at young people coming out of university, what they expected to make 30 years ago versus now is two different worlds. There's a much greater transparency now than there was then. But yeah, it's completely different.
What do you mean about greater transparency now regarding salaries?
Oh, because you have the internet. You can find out what other companies are paying. It's not that hard to find out what new salaries are anymore. It used to be a real guessing game.
It seems like
They talk a lot more. There's websites like Glassdoor where people are public. There's a lot of information out there. Yes.
What is the effect, the overall effect of telecommuting?
Of
Telecommuting.
Oh, telecommuting. Yeah. I think it's here to stay. I think the remote work is a trend that's not going to go away. Young people now, if they want to work in the office 1 or 2 days a week, it's something companies are almost going to have to accept. And a lot of companies have been very aggressive trying to get people back in the office, and those companies have lost some talented people, quite frankly.
It's had a tremendous effect, like in New York.
Yeah, of course.
Real estate market.
Right. Of course. Yeah, I've been in New York a lot lately, and there's a lot of property. There's more property available now, just because, especially on the commercial side, but also in the commercial side. We haven't even talked about commercial real estate, but the commercial real estate sector really hit hard in many cities. New York, for one, Cleveland. We've seen many companies downsizing their office size down there. It's changed many downtowns. I don't know what it's like around here, but certainly downtown Cleveland is not the place it was before COVID. It's having a huge change on many different businesses, on the way people work, and young people want that. Young people are saying, yeah, I don't want to be in the office 5 days a week, so I have 3 other job offers, and they're offering me 3 days at home. What are you going to do?
Like, what do you see the short and long-term impact on municipalities and infrastructure, the ability to deliver to their constituents?
In terms of infrastructure,
Right.
well, we're seeing, around the world, there's an not unprecedented, but for the modern times, unprecedented push, surge in infrastructure spending. So we're seeing, but a lot of that is going into reparations as opposed to expansion of infrastructure. My argument is always infrastructure investments are usually a very good thing. You need the quicker you can get your product to a port or to an airport, whatever it may be, the better it is in the modern world. So having an infrastructure that promotes exports, that keeps people keeps them from being stuck in their car for 45 minutes. I've lived in Europe half my life, and some of those old towns with roads that are designed for horses, you're stuck in a car all the time, unless you're on public transport. But yeah, I think there's going to continue to be a surge in infrastructure spending. But again, governments are going to run into this debt issue. So right now we have a surge in it, but how long can that be maintained? Every society where you've said lower economic growth and lower population growth eventually leads to a decline in infrastructure quality over time. It happens because you can't invest as much. If you look back in history, at the moment we have a surge, we're going to have it, but what's going to happen 10, 20 years, 30 years down the road without higher rates of growth, it's hard to see that continuing.
Michael, this one's touchy. Based on Disney, Boeing, BlackRock, and so forth, what impact do you see DEI and ESG having over the next 5 years?
It had there was a big surge in DEI hiring up until about 2021, end of 2021, 2022. There's been a decline now. I think it was 40-some%. I think it's going to continue. I thought when you mentioned Boeing, you're going to mention the doors falling off the plane.
Supposedly that's the reason, because of
Boeing is, I like Boeing, but they've had a really bad run lately. It's really a problem. I think DEI is clearly here to stay. Some will focus on the diversity, some will focus on some of the other issues within it. But shareholder activism, consumer activism is here to stay, and I think we're going to continue to see it. I think it kind of had a big surge, but I don't think it's going to go away.
You mentioned 3 25 basis point reductions in your forecast. The Fed kind of provided provided guidance of that, and the market immediately went to 6. Where's the gap? Or what's creating that gap between the market expectations and your forecast and the Fed?
Yeah, I think a lot of the market expectations are being set by people not reading the Fed notes. I mean, if you just read them, they're not talking much about. They're really cautious. They're more cautious than when you read an article in the Wall Street Journal about interest rates. It's a completely different world than if you read the Fed notes. The Fed notes are saying you just read between the lines. We're very concerned about core inflation. The job market is really too strong right now. Too strong is maybe the wrong way to put it. But yeah, I think there's just the expectation, the expectation. I mean, so there was a survey of I forget who it was, and it was like 60% were expecting a rate cut by March, which, I mean, there could be a dramatic change and something could happen in the next month. But it's really hard for me to see that happening. So I'm very much looking at the second half of this year.
Hi, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning.
Regarding the ports, we saw what happened when things got really crazy and chaotic. We don't know when, hey, a slow market, things dip. Things can get chaotic again. But to mitigate risk again, right? That's what always, how do we mitigate that? Is there any investments being made domestically in the ports here to better those sort of things, whether it be automation or I'm just curious from a national scale.
Right.
What are we doing here to mitigate those sort of risks so the next whatever wave of craziness that comes about, how do we better our situations?
Well, certainly there's a lot of investment in automation because what happened a few years ago was driven by workers not being in place because of COVID on both sides of the ocean. I'll probably learn more about that this afternoon, at my lunch at the Port Authority while I'm speaking. But if you want to go up to Canton. But yeah, that led to a tremendous surge. I mean, around the world, the port sector is one of the fastest growing adapters of automation because of what you just talked about. So yeah, that's one way to mitigate the potential risk of labor shortages causing massive disruptions like they did during COVID.
Does our government get involved though in those sort of investments? Hey, listen, we're gonna, it's what we do. It's
governments sometimes are a little reluctant to work in programs that take away jobs. So right? It's like it's a bad look. So the private sector tends to have to drive that a little more, but they should be. And I think there's a national security issue there as well. So they should be promoting it as such.
You mentioned some recent quarterly improvements in productivity after years of saying nothing's really happening here. Wondering, are there any kind of hard ideas of what's making those changes? And AI is fascinating, and I'm sure long term it's going to make a change, but I'm a little skeptical that it's big enough impact at this point to be changing top-line numbers.
Yeah, productivity numbers are the most difficult numbers to interpret in economics. It takes a long time to really process them. It could be, we're still doing it. I think the automation component, which was just brought up, which has been going on for some time. There was a big surge in automation expenditures during and after COVID. That's probably playing a bigger role. I would say that would, we'll have to look at them still. There's still really not much detail, but I'm going to guess it's more into that sector. Yeah, AI has the potential long term, but business, keep in mind as well, AI came to our consciousness or the public's consciousness at the end of 2022, but businesses were using AI for a long time. And a lot of what's out there in the private, what the real advanced AI is so much more advanced than what we're using on ChatGPT or Bard. So it has been being used for longer than we've been testing it out for the last 15 months or so. So that's it. I think it has probably had a little impact. Its impact will be bigger going forward.
What will driverless vehicles do for putting more people in the job? You think of all the semis on the road that could be driverless.
Yeah, because I remember the first people, and this was way back when, who would tell me they couldn't find workers were trucking companies. That was the first sector I really felt like they're really struggling to find people. And so, I know some people that own trucking companies, and I always ask them, how is it fine? And it's worse than ever. That's how they answer it. It's impossible to find people. So yeah, that could definitely improve our productivity by having
the 800 numbers on the back of every semi,
yeah,
every night or home weekend, trying to sweeten up the deal to get.
Yeah. I've heard the two things I've heard is we can't find people, and when we do, they're so much less qualified than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So it's a real challenge.
Listening to my wife, the professor, college students are jumping into AI big time.
Yeah, on their
It's gonna
tests.
be another challenge for universities, colleges, education in general.
Yeah, there's some sectors that young people now realize that there are some sectors of the economy where, in some sectors, you absolutely need the education. There's no way around it. But there are some sectors of the economy now where you can get a certificate or you can get some kind of training, and that the 4-year college route is not necessarily the way you need to go.
Attitudes about the value of college.
Yeah. Yeah, so not only is your youth population shrinking, but the percentage of those people who maybe want to go to college is less than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So that's a good point. So it's a real challenge for universities. You've probably seen in the news some of the figures from some major universities in Northeast Ohio who have laid off quite a bit of staff and professors because there's just not as many students.
Trade is a big shortage.
Skilled trade as a shortage. Yeah, and like I said, jobs with your hands, AI is not going to replace that. Not yet, until they build the robots to replace that. But yeah, so it's a security issue, job security issue as well. All right, I kept my voice.
Yeah. We'll take this last one.
All right.
I don't know if this is so much of a question, but say 20, 25 years ago, I had had occasion to travel to the Philippines. And at that time, and I don't know if this still holds true, they had a very rich population and an extremely poor population, but the middle class was growing. And looking at your presentation today, they're one of the emerging markets that seems to be pretty strong.
Yes.
In the Asian markets. And I wonder if that's not a direct correlation to what was happening 20, 25 years ago.
Sure, it is a creation of the middle class, because a lot of those economies, especially like the Philippines, had a small but wealthy upper class and then a larger underclass. And as that economy grows 5-6% per year, wages go up even more, you develop a middle class. And the Philippines is an example of a country that has done that. And they've been able to attract a lot of investment, particularly in services. A lot of English-speaking people there. We have people from the Philippines working for our firm. Fantastic.
I had always been told the Philippine people are very adaptable. They're actually very good with languages.
Yes.
Because if they graduate high school, they speak probably 3 different languages just by getting through high school. They
Sure.
speak whatever their native
Tagalog, yeah.
Tagalog, and English if they graduate high school.
Yeah, we have a absolutely great experience with the people from the Philippines who've worked for us. Yeah, that's a great. It's one of they invest in education, they attract investment in jobs where wages are going to go up. You build a middle class, and that puts your economy on much more solid footing. And they've been very successful at that. There's still a ways to go, obviously, but it's made great progress over the last 30 years.
I've called a couple of different company helplines that are answered in the Philippines because noon here is midnight there.
Right.
And English is their first language.
Exactly. Yeah, they're one of the big success stories right now in the economy. And you imagine it's a country with different ethnic groups, different religions, all thousands of islands, and yet they've managed to be one of the most successful economies in the world.
Can we share the PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Everybody can have a copy.
All right, I will send it out probably on Monday.